Hi guys, this is Raya and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be reviewing the debut full-length album from Madison Beer called Life Support. So those of you who don't know who Madison Beer is, she's a singer who came to prominence around 2013 when she was scouted by Justin Bieber of all people for making YouTube covers, and then started making some songs of her own, which were very bubblegum pop early on. She started making songs that were a little more in the darker vein around 2017 with her song Dead. She started making some more alt-pop type songs like that. And it was really interesting to see. She's had a number of collaborations with artists like Offset and Jax Jones, Jack and Jack, and of course she's been part of the mega popular animated K-pop girl group KDA, which is associated with League of Legends. She's been a vocalist featured on songs like More, Villain, and Pop Stars. So, she's actually carved out quite a name for herself, despite not being as popular as a lot of the artists who've had a major success over on the Hot 100. But she does have a pretty decently large fan base, and she released an EP in around 2018 called As She Pleases. So, there were a bunch of songs on that EP, which were singles she'd already released, or a few new songs there, and we got songs like Home With You, and of course, Dead, and probably my favorite, Teenager in Love, but overall, that EP has really aged poorly. I look back at it, and I see a lot of really sloppy production, and I'm not sure how to feel about it. A song like Home With You, which does admittedly have a really catchy hook, just has some really cheap-sounding production that does not suit Madison. And I just don't find her to be that charismatic on those tracks. I do like Hurts Like Hell with Offset, which was a collab she released. It's a pretty great song, and it's a good indicator that Madison loves the vocoder effect, which we'll get to when we start talking about the album itself. So here we are with Madison finally releasing her debut album. I mean, the first single from this came out over a year ago, and well, the album's finally here, and what do I think of Life Support? So first of all, a little backstory. Madison stated on Instagram the reason her album is called Life Support is because she wrote it during a hard time mentally in her life, and it was something that helped her cope. Whether or not that's reflected in the songs is a different question, but using art to distract you is definitely a valid reason to create something, and of course the pandemic. But this did take a bit longer to come out, probably partially because of the pandemic. But here Madison is finally releasing her debut album. Now, I do think that this is a pretty tight and cohesive project, and I'll get into that shortly. First of all, the production is a huge step up from her past work. And overall, there's some pretty good instrumentation choices on this record. Life Support is a pretty low-key alternative pop record, which features songs about being a young woman, toxic relationships, and mental illness. I mean, that's pretty much what the entire album is about. It's either a song about a toxic ex or dealing with mental illness. That's pretty much all of the songs on the album, except for a couple exceptions, like a song like Baby, which is just a sex song, so there's that. But then we have, basically all of the singles off this album. The first single was Good and Goodbye, and this was a song that came out over a year ago, and I still quite like the song. It's kind of simplistic, and I do think that the wordplay is pretty clever, but somewhat basic. And I do like how direct the song is, with telling off her ex, calling him toxic to his face. I like that a lot. And I do like the vocoder effects through a lot of this album. A lot of these songs are pretty direct about her exes here. They start with a lot of minimalism. A lot of them start with like a minimalist beat or a loop. A song like Good and Goodbye starts with this minimalist kind of synthesized piano, and then of course Follow the White Rabbit starts with this really grungy bass line that's like the entire basis of it. Baby is a song that starts with this really simple yet addictive guitar loop that just kind of plays throughout the entire song. And of course they add in the more lush production choices. As far as her peers have gone, it's definitely not as raw as somebody like Gabby Hanna or Maggie Lenman or even Halsey's last album, but I do think that taking a more polished angle to this downbeat alternative pop thing is definitely working out in Madison's favor. She has a really pretty voice, especially in her lower register. She doesn't have that gorgeous breathy falsetto that somebody like Billie Eilish has, but I do like her lower register a lot, and if you find somebody like Halsey's voice annoying, then I definitely think Madison Beer can be someone whose voice you can like. Overall, this is one of the more cohesive alternative pop albums I've heard, and I'm definitely pretty impressed with this. No wonder she took a long time to release it. It feels like it's a rare album in this day and age where she actually put thought into making the album a cohesive flowing project. It has an intro and outro. Not a big fan of the outro being there, but whatever. The intro flows great into Good and Goodbye. The singles actually feel like they're decently well placed on the album, and there's a bizarre Rick and Morty sample at the end of Homesick, which goes straight into the song Selfish, which was one of her singles. I do think having weird vocal samples from unrelated things is definitely something that is a thing in alternative pop, and it's something that I've seen a lot. Specifically Billie Eilish. I think the most blatant example of that was the very prominent Office audio sample in My Strange Addiction on Billie's album, which was extremely solid, by the way. So I'm definitely intrigued to hear what's going on next with Billie, as that last album she made was very dark and tense, and she seems to be going for some more prettier vocal harmonies and melodies with some of the songs she's released. So I almost wonder if this is more like what Billie Eilish's next album could sound like. There are a lot of dark parts in the production here. Specifically, songs like Follow the White Rabbit has some pretty dark and dense production on the chorus, and there's some other parts of the album where it feels like it just kind of goes together. Default is another song which is pretty short. It's basically an interlude, even though it's not called interlude. There is an actual interlude on this album. They're about the same length. But Default has some pretty dark, tense production elements toward the end of the song. A lot of the songs are more minimalist and sad sounding than angry. Boyshit is probably one of the only songs that goes into that vein, and I do like the bombast of it a lot, with the horns and all that. Basically dismissing this guy as just being immature and toxic. And I also really love the dramatic string intro to Selfish, especially coming off that Rick and Morty sample. I do really think that the song itself has a nice theatrical, dramatic vibe to it while still being relatively minimalist. It's got some strings that come in more again towards the final chorus, and it does have a really minimalist but pretty guitar loop going throughout it. The song is of course about an ex who was extremely toxic, and it really plays into a similar lane as something like Butterflies by Gabby Hanna, which was a song about where the narrator basically regrets ever getting into this relationship. She knew it was a bad idea from the start, but she couldn't resist this person. And that's kind of the way Selfish is framed. There's a couple cuts on here that aren't about Madison's relationships. Specifically, songs like Stained Glass and Effortlessly. Stained Glass was released as a single, and I do really like how pretty her vocals sound with the spare piano at the beginning of the song. It's actually a slightly more up-tempo song, which is kind of odd considering the subject matter, which of course is a pretty severe song, clearly about depression. Another song which I feel like is about depression is Effortlessly, which is a song where Madison basically states that she used to be able to do all these things easily, and now they're a lot harder for her, which is something I can definitely relate to as someone who's lived with depression. It can make you tired and exhausted, and it can be hard to even get out of bed sometimes. Another song with a very relatable title to me is Stay Numb and Carry On, which is being framed as the case of a relationship here, but just that title alone is my entire last couple years, and honestly, I don't advise that. Definitely let yourself feel things when you can. It's important. But yeah, there's a couple other nice cuts on here. Again, I really like the vocal melodies, the layering, the falsetto elements. She doesn't go into it as much, but when she does on something like Blue, it's pretty pleasant. Again, not really as good as something like Billie, but I do still enjoy it. She's definitely not going as hard on her exes or going as raw or harsh as Gabby Hanna or Maggie Lindman or even Halsey, as I said already. Halsey's last album was kind of a clusterfuck. I did like a lot of the songs, but it went on for way too long, and it does show that a cohesive EP can sometimes be so much better than an album when your song goes on for too long. In this case, this is a full-length album, but I didn't think it really felt like filler. Yeah, there's a couple tracks that I probably won't be returning to that much, but overall, they didn't really feel cluttered, and the album didn't have a bunch of forgettable, messy songs like Halsey's album. For instance, Manic was an album that just plopped Without Me into the middle of the album. Without Me was a single she released the year before, and I do like the song alright. It's a pretty downbeat song. about an ex, but the problem with that is that it was just a song that didn't really fit the album, and they just put it on there because it was a single. Same thing of Camila Cabello's album Romance. They just put Senorita on there because it was a single, which I thought didn't really work too well. I know you could argue the album's about Shawn Mendes and their relationship, but still, Senorita does not fit the album at all, and it's just an overplayed song. Whereas if Good and Goodbye Here being the first single that came out a year before, it's the first song on the album after the intro, and I do think it sets the tone really well. It's still one of my favorites. So, overall, I do feel like Madison put a lot of work into making this a cohesive project, unlike many of her peers who just kind of string songs together in an EP format or try to put them into an album. As I already mentioned, Halsey's album is kind of a clusterfuck. I do think the only other person who's really been able to string together a really cohesive project out of this is Billie Eilish, of course, and obviously you're not going to be beating that anytime soon, but I do definitely think this plays into a more polished vocal lane, where Madison isn't technically a great singer, but a lot of the effects on her voice are nice, and she does have a very pleasant lower register. And again, I do like how cohesive the project is. I talked about Maggie Linden's debut EP recently, and it was just kind of a mess overall. I did like a lot of the songs. The highs were great, but it was just like a mess of different genres. When you only have 8 songs, and your genres range from regular alternative pop to a sparse ukulele ballad to hyperpop to punk pop to emo, it's just a bit much. It's a bit too much whiplash, and it does really feel mixtapey in that regard and not like a cohesive project. Whereas if Madison's album here actually feels cohesive, like all the songs flow together pretty well, and there aren't really any songs I'm saying, oh, that's terrible. But there are a couple that I find to be somewhat forgettable. I don't think the last real song before the outro, which is Everything Happened for a Reason, that song's pretty forgettable to me. It's just kind of slow and doesn't really go anywhere. And that is kind of how I feel about something like Default. It didn't really need to be there. It's just really short. It's basically just an interlude to get from Good and Goodbye to Follow the White Rabbit. But overall, I do really think this is a really solid album. Like I said, I can't really recommend it over something like When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go? But that's a pretty high praise overall, so I'm feeling pretty confident giving this a light 8 out of 10. If you're curious, definitely check this out if you like this kind of downbeat alternative pop. And vocoder effects, of course, because they're all over this album. So definitely check it out. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, click like, subscribe to my channel, and follow my social media, linked in the description. And I'll see you all guys soon. Goodbye!